Vancouver is, and always has been, one of the most livable cities in the entire world. It's a bustling city on the west coast that's known for its mountain ranges, the modern skyline, and its famous destinations, from the seawall to the famous Granville Island. We wanted to know what exactly makes Vancouver so livable, and why it's the fifth best city in the whole world. But that's not the case.
Cost of housing continues to be one of the most pressing issues.
Housing in BC has seen another spike.
Prices skyrocket.
Highest rental costs in the country.
Housing and rent prices have been skyrocketing, growing even more than the rate of inflation. So why is Vancouver still a top 5 city in livability when it can't even house its own citizens? On today's episode of the investment series, we're going to uncover why Vancouver remains so desirable, yet struggles to find a solution to solve issues facing even its own citizens. Considering all the recent inflation struggles around the world and also here in Vancouver, all the rising gas prices and housing prices, do you guys think Vancouver is still a great place to live or has become out of reach?
So basically what I researched was if an average person had to live in Vancouver, they had to make an hourly wage of above $30 per hour to be able to rent out a one-bedroom apartment if, let's say, this rent took up 30% of their total income. And obviously, as you can see, our minimum wage is currently like $16 and a bit more. So that's completely unaffordable for an average individual if they wanted to, sustain themselves and live a comfortable life in Vancouver.
Yeah, the climate's quite temperate. It's a good place to live, which is why so many people are moving here. Cities are trying to make themselves more attractive to people moving there. Unfortunately, immigration is also a factor of inflation. It increases the demands for the goods locally. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the reasons that food prices and things are climbing because and especially like things like housing. You hear about Vancouver housing being some of the most unaffordable in the world, and part of that is due to the so-called immigration crisis, I guess. Is it really referred to as a crisis?
I don't believe it's called a crisis.
Yeah, but
it hasn't become a crisis yet.
Yeah, but it is very, very expensive.
That is true.
And the supply isn't really keeping up. So
yeah. So like now when you look at like if you want to like get housing, price to rent like a one-bedroom apartment is like $3,500 a month. So if it's $3,000 a month, you need like, what is that? $36,000 a year just for housing. Definitely not everyone can afford that, and a lot of people can't.
Vancouver has seen this before. Take Brentwood Town Centre, for example. There's been a lot of development around rapid transit lines in the past few years or so. And Brentwood is no exception. Brentwood Town Centre is an urban center located in the city of Burnaby, roughly a quarter of an hour away from downtown Vancouver. Recently, there's been a lot of developments in this area, such as a modern-style mall and countless new apartment buildings. However, it hasn't come cheap. The newest apartments for rent cost well over $25,000, making it very expensive for people to move in. If you actually have like a pretty high wage, let's say $100K, right? $100K, that's a pretty high salary in Vancouver. If you wanted to buy a house, which is like, let's say 1 million. It's not 1 million these days, but if it's $1 million and you make a down payment of like 20%, right? And then you have mortgage, right? That mortgage is gonna like that down payment is not going to cover up the majority of your purchase, right? As we know, houses are like basically one of the like biggest acquisitions an average person would make in their lifetime. And the fact that you have to pay your mortgage over 10, 15, 20, 30 years, that doesn't make it livable either. Yeah, so I think Vancouver, although it's a great city to live, it has lots of great places, lots of stuff to do, it's not livable. It's only livable for the rich, I feel like. That's what I feel.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that, like, especially now, we have really, really high interest rates. So especially when it comes to something like getting a house or something that you have to pay monthly interest rate because due to your mortgage, you still have like the interest rate is just so high right now that it's almost unrealistic to be paying back all of it plus more to try to get rid of your mortgage and also try to maintain like standard like healthy living style.
Which I think, of course, taking these into account, I think it's also kind of about what we see as like a good standard of living, right? Because some people might find themselves to be okay with living on like 50 to 60,000, right? But others may want to or go for that 90,000. And so I think it also we should look at how Vancouver is in general, right? Like, because if let's say you're living in a small 1 bedroom apartment or even just like a studio flat, right? I mean, I think it could be interesting to look at because people do say, right, Vancouver's got a lot of good things going for it, right? And so when you look at it perhaps in the more central regions, right, you got in Canada, right, you have Alberta. Of course, I'm not just throwing shit at Alberta, right? I'm just pointing out that there is less development there, which the Canadian government is trying to fix or try to improve upon. But currently, Vancouver is much better. So perhaps, yes, we do pay more. And there's, of course, a huge chunk of money being taken away and for just daily life and surviving. But I think it's also interesting to consider, like, are we that much worse off if we went to Alberta, perhaps, in comparison in terms of like ease of access and all that.
Yeah, I think it's also important to consider lower income individuals who are living in Vancouver because like a lot of them usually commute to Vancouver to work. So let's say they live in a relatively rural area, such as like where we live, and then they take the SkyTrain or they drive their car for an hour to work so that they're able to afford better housing. But I think even for them, it's not that sustainable because if you go downtown and you park your car, it's like $10 an hour or something like crazy rates. And then you also have to find a parking spot. And I think just those prices themselves are a huge burden for those lower income individuals who are commuting there.
Housing, if you think about it, if you rent a place, if you make, let's say, 5K per month, and as Ethan said, the average rent here is about 3K, right? But that is the majority of what you're gonna make. All the rest is gonna go on groceries, eating out, gas, other stuff like that. So I do think housing is a big majority of your costs per month, costs per year, and all that.
So I mean, going back to like, is Vancouver livable and inflation? I think this is I think perhaps we can also incorporate another portion is like, how about us, right? Because we are all kind of poised at that edge of going into society. So what about personally, right? Because inflation and all this, we're talking about this like on a grander scale right now, but how is that going to impact individuals? I think is something else we should like on the micro scale.
Yeah. So right now, like if you want to rent an apartment, like right now, start renting it, it's like 3K. But like you said, there's a law that prevents people from raising their rents too much, and you actually can only raise it like 1-2% or some very small number each year.
But it's already at 3K. That's like
Yeah.
if you go back
Which is-
5 years, that's
Yeah, but
unthinkable.
that's the thing is like maybe like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, rents were definitely not that high. Maybe 1K, 1.5K.
Actually.
So for a lot of people who are renting right now in Vancouver, the only reason why they are able to rent is because their landlords can't raise their rent prices that much. But the problem is if they move out, they have to move to a new place, then the rent automatically goes up to 3K or even higher. So a lot of people are in a very precarious situation.
Yeah, and actually, now that you mentioned that, I remember, I believe 6 years, maybe 7 years ago, we actually did a project in school that basically had us look at suburb and also the urban areas and the pricing, how much it will cost to live. I remember quite clearly, right, that I saw the prices were 1.5 and maybe near 2K then, and I was thinking that it's insane. So now it's 3K, right? So it's quite a big jump.
Okay, so I think that 3K is like you're referring to like specifically like downtown Vancouver or something, right? Because like around here it's like 2K at max for like one bedroom and such.
Around
2K. I don't think so. If you
like
Burnaby, like Brentwood, Metrotown, Vancouver, all of
like
all
even
Vancouver's.
in Coquitlam, it's still like 2.5.
We'll have to check. Yeah,
Or like
it's generally
well, I
at that.
recently checked and it was like around 2K like average for like one bedroom, one bathroom. It was,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like as you get close to Vancouver,
Yeah,
it's much more
it's gonna get
expensive.
higher.
So I
Right?
think like more people are like moving out of Vancouver to like suburban districts.
Yes.
Where they can like afford
And
housing for cheaper.
yeah, and that's why like all the suburbs in Metro Vancouver, like Surrey, Coquitlam, I don't know if Burnaby is considered a suburb. I think it's not in Vancouver. That's why like there has been so much development in those areas, urban areas, and actually I believe Surrey is going to surpass downtown Vancouver in population in the next like few years, which is crazy to me.
And so coming back to the consumer price index, like I believe, like I think generally over like the past 10 years, it rose up like, nearly double. Like it's very quickly how like it grows. Then like as of like 2017, when like the BC like decided to raise the minimum wage to $15, it's been gradually increasing ever since.
It's like 15.50 now.
Wait, no, it's like 1675 or something.
Here?
Yeah, BC. They raised it like June. But then like as it raises, it continues to like push inflation even higher.
Yeah, I think it has this effect where it's like if the government starts raising minimum wage, everything starts to cost more because the employers need to offset, the increased costs that they have to pay workers. And I think probably the biggest determinant of price itself is just likely population and the demand for a certain item. If you can see in these major cities, so many people are flooding into Vancouver because it's seen as the best city where you can get many opportunities, you can get paid a lot. And that's what's actually like pushing the price up so much because everyone wants a house in downtown Vancouver and it gets extremely expensive for people.
That's blaming him for the entire time so far.
Yeah. Well, generally, like Vancouver, if you even go to like the local media, it's been talking about inflation, like CBC, CTV. It's been talking about inflation all day, all year, about how unaffordable Vancouver is. But Vancouver generally is, I think, one of the best places in the world to live, if not the best. I think. So that is, I guess, a reason why Vancouver has been unaffordable, because people have been flocking into Vancouver because it's such a great place to live. Compared to like Calgary and Edmonton, where snows half the year, and it's like negative 40 degrees or something. All right, there's a reason for that. There's a reason for everything.
I have been hearing people warning against people moving to Vancouver just because of the prices and stuff. But it still seems that immigration is still increasing, or I don't know if it's increasing necessarily.
It is. I believe it is.
Okay.
It's 500,000 a year.
Yes, but
Inflation isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's usually associated with like higher rates of economic growth. You have a bigger workforce. You have more people buying, more people producing. In general, it could be viewed as a good thing, but the problem with inflation is that it makes things obviously unaffordable. So that's kind of the government's job to keep it in check while still sustaining that kind of economic growth. So like the ideal is around 1% inflation annually, which keeps the economy going, but also doesn't make things unaffordable too fast.
Yeah, and I feel like what's really important here is like the wages have to come up with inflation. So let's say if everything costs more, if you're getting paid more, it kind of offsets that. And a bit of inflation every year gives it so that employers can give their workers a raise, and it makes it seem like it's a really good thing. But in fact, it's just like offsetting the amount of inflation that exists within the economy.
But then again, the amount, the percentage of that raise does not match up with the percentage of increase in inflation.
Yeah, so,
right.
So inflation should, in theory, inflation happens because people have more money and they have that money and they're going to spend more money on things. But the problem is wages aren't going up that fast. So where's all the money going? And inequality is increasing. So like the rich people might not feel the effects that much, but the people closer to the bottom are just feel it.
Yeah, businesses have adapted to obviously inflation and all these like things because consumers are still spending at rates that we didn't expect them to spend.
Yeah, and right, and there's also I was reading The Economist 2 weeks ago, right, and one of the articles was on the idea of the higher for longer, right, meaning inflation, right, because I don't know if you guys covered this in econ or not. I learned this from the investment club's leader, president's predecessor, right, and he described basically as the economy goes up generally, but with like small, right, but it keeps on going down and up, but every time it raises. So you have an overall graph of rise, but in between it's like this, right? And basically it's saying that nowadays, right, the inflation rates are staying higher for longer periods of time, right? Which is problematic, especially concerning how we are spending a lot and then offsetting for later. When inflation rates are staying higher for longer, which means that everything's going to go up higher, going to go up quicker, without any like respite for the economy.
I mean, I think the best way to solve housing in Vancouver is to get the supply up, right? Because if you're putting a cap on the price of housing, that means that some people aren't able to get houses because there's a shortage of like sellers who are willing to lend or rent out their house. So I think the best way to solve this problem is trying to incentivize private developers or even governments as a whole to invest in as much as possible into housing so they can build more houses that it lowers the price. I think that's how we solve the expensive price of living in Vancouver.
Yeah, and if you see like all the urban areas around Vancouver, they have been doing that. All the major developers like Anthem, or, like Ledmac, what else? There's a lot out there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of developers out there. They're building a lots of new apartments, new high rises. Not in Vancouver, but in all the other areas in Metro Vancouver, like Burnaby, like Surrey, like Coquitlam, for example, and even in Langley,
Yeah.
which is like what an hour and a half from Vancouver if you drive, right? But they are building, like for example, SkyTrain over there.
Yeah.
To incentivize people to move out to more suburban areas, to kind of like move people away from the more expensive places in Vancouver, I would say, and move them out to other places that are less expensive. So in the end, government, I think, do notice the problem.
Yeah.
They do realize the significance of this problem.
Yeah.
But immigrants, they keep moving in.
Yeah,
There's
actually-
always going to be new immigrants.
Yeah, actually, I would like to actually point out something interesting at the end of this, right? Like, you mentioned they were building apartments, they're building complexes, and then and something interesting, right, that I think should be considered is how our overall culture views living, right? Because before we were talking about like housing prices, right? And I'm guessing we were all thinking single standalone houses, right? But right now the solution seems to be apartments, right? So I think that's also kind of something, right? Like, is Vancouver livable according to like the standards like 30 years ago, where a white picket fence, house, dog, 2 kids?
Yeah.
Maybe not, but if we change it to our current
This trend, right?
our current situations, we're going to get more apartments, we're going to get more housing complexes. It's not the exact same, but perhaps it is still livable, but just in a different form now.
Yeah. So I think we've come to our mutual conclusion that Vancouver is one of the most livable places to live. But in lieu of, when we think of inflation and all the increases in housing and all that, all the increase in prices over here in this local economy, consumers and residents of Vancouver have adapted, I think, and even business, they have adapted to the new trend of things that will continue to make Vancouver livable, I think. Not for all, but for most. Yeah. And thank you guys all for joining. Thank you guys all for bringing up some really interesting points. And yeah, see you next time.